Welcome, survivors, to the edge of the apocalypse, where every story is a fight to stay alive. Thanks from the bottom of my heart for every like, comment, and sub. Keep hitting that bell and join the fight with me. Thanks from the bottom of my heart.
The cold here doesn't just bite, it gnaws. It chews through layers of thermal wool and Gore-Tex until it finds the bone. My breath was forming jagged clouds of ice in front of my face, disappearing into the white void of the blizzard that had been raging for 3 days straight. The Geiger counter clipped to my belt gave a slow, rhythmic click, a metronome counting down the seconds of my life. Click, click, click. I shouldn't be here. No one should be here. But the coordinates from the encrypted transmission had led me to this specific grid in the middle of nowhere, hundreds of miles north of the nearest known settlement. I wiped the frost from my goggles and squinted. There it was. Not a natural rock formation, but concrete. Massive, reinforced slabs jutting out of the permafrost like the tombstone of a giant. The wind howled, sounding almost like human screaming, but I knew better. The real screaming was trapped inside that concrete. I checked the action on my rifle, the metal freezing against my gloved palm. The silence that followed the wind was heavy, pressurized. It smelled of ozone and ancient, stagnant air escaping from the vents I had just pried open. I squeezed through the breach, the heavy steel door groaning in protest, the sound echoing down a spiral staircase that seemed to descend into the bowels of the earth. The air temperature rose slightly, but the smell got worse. It wasn't just ozone anymore. It was copper. Blood. Old, dried, frozen blood. And something else. Something like rotting fruit left out in the sun, a sweet, cloying decay that made my stomach turn. I clicked on my tactical light. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes dancing in the dead air. The walls were lined with Cyrillic warnings, the red paint peeling like dead skin. I moved down, one step at a time, my boots crunching on debris. Glass. Shell casings. Bones. At the bottom of the landing, the facility opened up. It was a cathedral of science and death. Rows of smashed computer terminals, overturned desks, and papers scattered everywhere like autumn leaves. But it was the silence that unnerved me the most. It wasn't empty. I could feel it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, prickling against my collar. I moved toward the main corridor, stepping over a barricade made of filing cabinets and lab equipment. It had been breached from the inside. Whatever they were trying to keep out was already in here with them. Suddenly, I froze. The clicking of my Geiger counter was joined by another sound. Faint. Wet. A shuffling noise like leather dragging on concrete. I killed my light, plunging the corridor into pitch blackness. My heart hammered against my ribs, loud enough, I feared, to give me away. The shuffling grew louder. Closer. And then came the sound that haunts my nightmares. A low, gurgling rattle, the sound of lungs filled with fluid trying to draw breath. I held my own breath, my hand tightening on the grip of my rifle. In the darkness, the smell of rot intensified, washing over me in a wave. I could hear the fabric of clothes rustling, the click of a zipper against a button, suggesting whoever, or whatever, was approaching was wearing a uniform. I pressed my back against the cold wall, waiting. The shuffling stopped mere feet from where I stood. I could hear it sniffing the air. Searching. Hunting. The wind outside didn't howl. It screamed, a constant, abrasive tearing sound that stripped the heat from my bones even through 3 layers of synthetic fur and Gore-Tex. But the silence inside the airlock was worse. It was a heavy, pressurized silence, the kind that rests at the bottom of an ocean. I spun the wheel of the inner blast door, the metal groaning in protest, flaking rust onto the frost-covered floor. With a final, agonizing clank, the seal broke. The air that rushed out wasn't stale. It was sterile, smelling of ozone and dead electricity. I stepped into the dark maw of the Vostok 4 facility, the beam of my tactical light cutting a cone through dust that hadn't moved in 20 years. The Siberian Tundra had been my purgatory for 3 months. A frozen hell where the shamblers usually froze solid before they could gnaw on your tibias. But I'd heard the rumors on the shortwave before the batteries died. The Russians had been working on something here. Something that didn't just survive the cold, it thrived in it. My boots crunched over shattered glass in the reception atrium. The reception desk was barricaded with overturned filing cabinets and a vending machine. Behind it lay the first bodies. They weren't skeletons. The cold had mummified them, turning skin into tight, gray leather stretched over bone. I knelt beside a guard, his uniform still bearing the insignia of the Ministry of Defense. My hands, trembling slightly from the adrenaline dump, patted down his tactical vest. Jackpot. 2 spare magazines for an AK-74, though the rifle itself was missing. I pocketed them, the brass casings clicking together, a sound that seemed deafening in the tomb-like quiet. I checked his belt. A Geiger counter. I flicked it on. A low, rhythmic clicking confirmed background radiation was elevated but not lethal. Good enough. I moved deeper, past the security checkpoints, and into the labyrinth of Sector B, bioresearch. The walls here were lined with reinforced polycarbonate observation windows. Most were smeared with dried organic matter, blood, bile, and things I didn't want to identify. I needed supplies. My stomach was a knotted fist of hunger, and my hydration pack was down to the last few sips of slush. I forced the door open with a crowbar, the hydraulic hiss of the pneumatic seal failing long ago. Inside was a lab, pristine compared to the hallway. Centrifuges sat silent on black countertops. I began the scavenge, the rhythm familiar and comforting. Open drawer. Scan. Close. Open cabinet. Scan. Take. I found a box of surgical masks, useless against the bite, but good for keeping the dust out. A first aid kit on the wall yielded a treasure trove, sealed bandages, a bottle of antiseptic that hadn't evaporated, and miracle of miracles, a blister pack of broad-spectrum antibiotics. I swallowed 2 dry, the bitter chalky taste sitting on my tongue like hope. But it was the fridge in the corner that drew me. It was hooked up to a backup power loop, indicated by a faint, dying red LED. I pried it open. Inside were vials. Hundreds of them. Labeled with Cyrillic alphanumerics. But on the bottom shelf, shoved behind a rack of test tubes, was a vacuum-sealed bag of military rations. Tushanka. Stewed meat. I tore into it with my teeth, not caring about the 20-year expiration date. The fat coated my mouth, greasy and salty. I ate while walking, gun in one hand, ration in the other, moving toward the lower levels where the generator hum originated. That's when I saw the first anomaly. I was in a corridor connecting the labs to the containment wing. A body lay on the floor, face down. Standard mummification. But as I stepped over it, I noticed the spine. It had shifted. The vertebrae were enlarged, pushed outward as if something had grown underneath them. I shined my light closer. The skin along the spine was translucent, revealing a network of black veins that didn't look like vascular tissue. They looked like fungal mycelium, thick and ropey. I nudged the corpse with my boot. It didn't move. I kept walking, but my grip on the crowbar tightened. The infection in the cities was simple: bite, fever, death, reanimation. They were mindless, driven by hunger, rotting until they fell apart. This was different. The architecture of the infection here seemed deliberate. I reached the stairwell to the sub-basement. The air grew colder here, dropping well below the ambient temperature of the upper levels. Frost coated the walls in geometric patterns. I descended, the metal grate stairs vibrating slightly under my weight. At the bottom, a heavy blast door stood ajar. Above it, a sign in red paint, Subject Containment Cryogenics. I entered a cavernous room filled with vertical glass tubes. Most were smashed, the fluid drained away. But the smell hit me instantly. It wasn't the smell of rot. It was the smell of high-voltage ozone and burned hair. Something shifted in the shadows to my left. I swung the light. It stood near a control console. It had been a man once, wearing a lab coat that was now shredded rags. But the physiology was wrong. It didn't slouch. It stood perfectly upright, its posture rigid. The skin was a pale, icy blue, entirely hairless. But the terrifying part was the heat. Even from 20 feet away, looking through my thermoscope, I could see it glowing. The infection had jump-started its metabolism into overdrive. It was a biological furnace. It turned its head. No jerky, zombie twitch. A smooth, predatory rotation. The eyes were gone, replaced by a singular, milky membrane that covered the entire orbital socket. "Shit," I whispered. The creature's mouth opened, unhinging wider than a human jaw should allow. It didn't groan. It emitted a high-frequency click, like a bat using echolocation. It stripped the silence away. I raised the Makarov and fired. The shot echoed like a cannon blast. The bullet hit center mass. It didn't fall. It didn't even stumble. The impact seemed to be absorbed by the dense, mutated muscle fibers. It shrieked then, a sound of tearing metal, and sprinted. Not a shamble. A sprint. It covered the 20 feet in a second. I threw myself to the right, crashing into a surgical trolley. Trays and scalpels clattered to the floor. The creature slammed into the wall where I had been standing, cracking the concrete. I scrambled back, switching the pistol to my left hand and grabbing the crowbar with my right. It turned, steam rising from its shoulders where the heat of its body met the freezing air. It lunged again. I swung the crowbar, aiming for the knee. Bone crunched, but it wasn't the dry snap of a dead thing. It was the wet break of living tissue. The thing howled, slapping me backward with a backhand that felt like getting hit by a swinging log. I slid across the floor, winded, tasting copper. It dragged its broken leg, still coming, faster than a cripple should move. I scrambled for the gun I dropped. My fingers brushed the cold steel. I rolled onto my back and unloaded the magazine. 1, 2, 3, 4 shots. The last one took it in the throat. Black blood, thick as tar and boiling hot, sprayed out. It gurgled, collapsing onto its knees, then face forward. It didn't stop moving immediately. The black veins beneath its skin pulsed violently, trying to knit the wound, trying to keep the host alive. The evolution of the virus. It wasn't just reanimating dead tissue anymore. It was restructuring it for survival in extreme environments. It had turned them into endothermic predators. I lay there for a moment, listening. The clicking started up again. From the vents. From the broken cryotubes. From the darkness beyond the blast door. There were more. I scrambled up, ignoring the bruising on my ribs. Scavenging was over. This wasn't a supply run anymore. It was an extraction. I grabbed a handful of glow sticks from a crate near the door and cracked them, throwing them down the hallway to create a perimeter of light. Green luminescence flooded the corridor. And in that green haze I saw them. Dozens of silhouettes. Some crawling on the walls with elongated limbs, others standing tall and steaming in the cold. They weren't just mindless eaters. They were a hive. And I had just rung the dinner bell. I ran. I sprinted back toward the stairwell, my lungs burning in the frigid air. Behind me, the chorus of clicks and shrieks rose into a cacophony. I slammed the stairwell door shut and jammed the crowbar through the handles just as the first body slammed against it. The metal buckled. I climbed, taking the steps 2 at a time. I needed to get to the roof. The tundra was death, yes. The cold would kill me slowly. But down here? Down here was a new epoch of apex predators, and humanity was just the biomass fuel they needed to burn. The wind outside was a physical weight, a screaming banshee of ice and pressure that hammered against the reinforced blast doors of Project 9. I had spent 3 days trekking through the whiteout, following a static-filled broadcast on a dead frequency, and now, standing before the frosted steel of the airlock, the silence of the facility felt heavier than the storm. I jammed the crowbar into the manual override socket. The hydraulics groaned, a sound like a dying whale, and the heavy wheel turned. With a hiss of depressurization that smelled of ozone and stale, recycled air, the door swung inward. I was in. The transition from the howling tundra to the oppressive stillness of the entryway was jarring. My breath plumed before me in the beam of my tactical light. The cone of illumination cutting through dust motes that had been suspended in the dark for a decade. This wasn't just a bunker, it was a tomb. I swept the room, standard military checkpoint. A plexiglass booth, metal detectors, and the frozen remains of 2 guards. They weren't shamblers. They were dead, slumped against the wall, preserved perfectly by the sub-zero temperatures that had seeped into the facility's bones. I moved to the first guard, suppressing the instinct to recoil. Survival meant stripping the dead. My fingers were numb despite my gloves, fumbling with the webbing of his vest. I found a Glock 17, frozen solid, useless until thawed, and 2 magazines of 9mm ammunition. Gold. I pocketed a faded keycard and a sealed packet of beef stroganoff MRE. The date code was 12 years old, but hunger makes you forgiving. The scavenging was good, too good. Usually, places like this were picked clean or destroyed by the panic of the initial outbreak. The fact that the gear was still here meant that whoever came in never came out, or the lockdown happened so fast that nobody had time to loot. I pushed deeper, moving past the checkpoint into the main atrium. The architecture was brutalist Soviet functionality meets high-tech containment. Emergency lights flickered on a dying auxiliary loop, casting strobing red shadows against the concrete. I checked my Geiger counter. Background radiation was nominal. It wasn't a nuke that killed this place. I found a stairwell, the elevator shaft a gaping maw of darkness, and began the descent. Level B1 was administration. Level B2 was barracks. I needed B3, labs and containment. That's where the answers, and the medical supplies, would be. On B2, I found the first sign that the infection here was wrong. I was rifling through a locker in the barracks, pulling out a thermal liner to replace my torn jacket, when I saw the writing on the wall. It wasn't blood. It was a black, viscous substance that had hardened into a resin. "IT doesn't freeze," was scrawled in jagged, frantic letters. Beneath it, a corpse lay on a cot. I approached cautiously, weapon raised. The body was gray, the skin tight against the skull, but it was covered in a translucent, crystalline frost. Not ice. It looked organic, like a fungus made of glass. I leaned in closer. The crystals were growing out of the pores, forming a jagged armor over the chest and shoulders. This was the evolution. I'd seen the bloaters in the cities and the runners in the grasslands, but the cold had forced the virus to adapt. It couldn't rely on rotting flesh that would freeze solid. It had to become something else. Something durable. I touched the crystal with the tip of my knife. It was hard as granite. Suddenly, the corpse's eyes snapped open. They weren't the milky white of standard ZS. They were a piercing, bioluminescent blue. I scrambled back as the creature sat up. It didn't groan. The sound coming from its throat was a dry, clicking rattle, like stones grinding together. It moved with a jerky, mechanical stiffness, the frozen joints snapping audibly. I didn't wait. I raised my rifle and put 2 rounds into its head. The sound was deafening in the small room. The bullets didn't splatter brain matter. They shattered the face like a porcelain vase. The creature collapsed, chunks of frozen flesh and crystal skittering across the floor. "Fragile," I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. "But armored." I hurried out of the barracks, the clicking sound echoing from other rooms. They were waking up. The heat from my body, the noise, I had rung the dinner bell. I sprinted for the stairwell, sliding down the railing to bypass the flights, landing hard on the concrete of level B3. This was the heart of the beast. The air here was even colder, biting through my layers. The layout was a maze of glass-walled observation rooms and sealed biolabs. I needed antibiotics, and if the rumors were true, the experimental viral suppressants this lab was synthesizing when the world ended. I moved into a central lab, the beam of my light sweeping over smashed centrifuges and shattered sample vials. On a central desk, a terminal was blinking. I wiped the frost from the screen. A digital log entry remained open. I hit play. Dr. Vakitov, log 442. A voice crackled, thick with a Russian accent and exhaustion. The Pathfinder strain has mutated in response to the climate control failure. We thought the cold would sterilize the subjects. We were wrong. The pathogen has begun to utilize the host's calcium and water content to create a lattice structure. It acts as a biological antifreeze and an exoskeleton. They are entering a state of suspended animation, preserving the host indefinitely until a heat source presents itself. They are not dead. They are waiting. If you are hearing this, do not restore power to the heating grid. I repeat, do not. The audio cut out. I looked up. Beyond the glass of the main containment chamber, rows of tanks stood in the darkness. Inside them were the test subjects. Dozens of them. They were covered in the blue crystal, hulking figures that looked more like statues than men. And the glass of the tanks was frosted over, but I could see the condensation of my own breath fogging the window. My heat. I began to scavenge frantically, abandoning stealth. I swept an arm across a supply shelf, dumping vials into my pack. Epinephrine, broad-spectrum antibiotics, sterile bandages, and a small, heavy case marked with a biohazard symbol and the code. C suppressant V04. A loud crack echoed through the lab. I froze. In the containment room, one of the tanks had spiderwebbed. A fist, encased in jagged blue ice, punched through the reinforced glass. Liquid nitrogen spilled out in a heavy fog, and the creature stepped through the breach. It was massive, the crystalline growth having formed a helmet-like structure over its head. It turned toward me, the thermal signature of my body a beacon in the freezing dark. Then another tank shattered. And another. I racked the slide of my rifle. Scavenging time was over. I bolted for the rear exit of the lab, heading for the emergency maintenance tunnels. Behind me, the sound of shattering glass and the terrible, rhythmic clicking of 100 frozen joints pursued me. I kicked open a door labeled Incinerator Access, hoping the residual heat might mask my trail or, if necessary, give me a weapon. The tunnel ahead was narrow, lined with pipes. I could hear them behind me, heavy, stomping footsteps that cracked the tile floor. These weren't the mindless shufflers that got stuck on doorknobs. These things were predatory. I reached a junction and spotted a pressure valve for the steam system. The gauge read 0, but the manual release had a red tag. Emergency vent. I spun the wheel. Nothing. The system was dormant. The first frost spider rounded the corner. It was fast, sprinting with a terrifying, loping gait. I fired a burst, aiming for the legs. The crystals shattered, and the leg snapped at the knee, sending the creature crashing into the wall. It didn't stop. It began to crawl, clawing at the floor with fingers that had fused into obsidian-sharp hooks. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned and the cold air tasted like blood. I found a vertical ladder leading to a surface hatch and scrambled up, my boots slipping on the rungs. Below me, the tunnel filled with the horde, a sea of glowing blue eyes and jagged silhouettes. I slammed the hatch shut and spun the locking wheel just as a heavy impact dented the steel from below. I fell back into the snow of the surface, the blizzard instantly swallowing me. I clutched a case of suppressant to my chest, gasping for air. The lab was sealed again, but I knew the truth now. The winter wouldn't kill them. It was making them stronger. And spring. Spring would unleash something the world wasn't ready for. The hydraulic seal of the blast door screamed as the manual override wheel finally turned. The sound vibrating through the bone-deep cold of my gloves. 60 years of ice had welded the frame shut, but the leverage of a steel pipe and desperation broke the bond. The heavy door swung inward, exhaling a breath of stale, chemically treated air that smelled of ozone and long-dead panic. I stepped out of the howling Siberian wind and into the silence of Facility 33. The blizzard outside had been a physical assault, stripping the heat from my body, but this silence was worse. It was predatory. I clicked my tactical light on, the beam cutting through a suspension of dust that hadn't moved since the Soviet Union fell. My Geiger counter on my chest rig gave a lazy, rhythmic click, safe levels, mostly. I wasn't here for the radiation. I was here for calories and warmth, in that order. The entry corridor was lined with decontamination showers, the plastic curtains yellowed and brittle. I moved with the practiced, rolling gait of a scavenger, keeping my weight low, my rifle tucked into my shoulder. The first body I found was a checkpoint guard, seated in a chair behind bulletproof glass. He was mummified by the dry, recycled air, his skin pulled tight over his skull like parchment. What caught my light wasn't the corpse, but the firearm on the desk, an outdated but pristine Makarov, and a half-eaten tin of beef stew. I smashed the glass with the butt of my rifle, the sound echoing like a gunshot down the concrete throat of the facility. I grabbed the gun, checking the action. Oiled. Functional. I pocketed it and moved to the tin. Even after decades, the sight of food triggered a painful cramp in my stomach, but I left it. Botulism was a slower killer than starvation, but just as final. I needed sealed goods. I pushed deeper, past the security checkpoint and into the residential sector. The layout was utilitarian, brutalist concrete softened only by the peeling propaganda posters celebrating scientific progress. I began checking lockers. This was the grind, the unglamorous reality of survival. I found a pair of thermal socks in a locker marked SGT. Volkov, stuffing them into my pack. In another, a box of 45mm ammunition, the brass dull but uncorroded. Gold. Pure gold. But it was in the mess hall that the nature of this place began to reveal itself. Tables were overturned, trays scattered. It looked like a riot had occurred, but there were no bodies on the floor. Just drag marks. thick, smeary trails of dried biological matter that led toward the ventilation ducts. I swept my light across the walls. Scratches. Deep gouges in the reinforced steel, too wide for human fingers, too coordinated for wild animals. I found a data pad on a supervisor's table, its battery miraculously holding a sliver of charge thanks to the ambient cold preserving the lithium. I bypassed the BIOS lock. Security protocols were a joke when the world had ended, and accessed the final logs. The text was fragmented, corrupted by time, but the medical reports were legible. They spoke of stage 4. The standard infection, the shambling, rotting necrosis we dealt with in the cities, was apparently just the incubation period. The virus wasn't killing the host. It was rewriting the genetic code to adapt to environmental stressors. Here, in the sub-zero tundra, the virus had realized that flesh freezes. So it changed them. I kept reading, my breath hitching in my throat. Subject 12 skin calcification complete. Dermis hardened to withstand -60°C. Metabolic rate slowed to near stasis. Heat sensitivity increased by 400%. I froze. Heat sensitivity. I was a walking, breathing radiator in a tomb of ice. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, I looked up at the ceiling vent directly above me. A distinct, rhythmic clicking sound drifted down. It sounded like ceramic tiles being tapped together. I backed away, raising my rifle. The vent grate exploded outward. The thing that dropped to the floor wasn't human anymore. It was a pale, alabaster nightmare. Its skin had hardened into a white, chitinous armor, seamlessly blending with the snowy environment outside. It had no eyes, useless in the dark winters, but its nasal cavity was flared, enormous, ridges of sensory organs pulsating as they tasted my body heat. It didn't moan. It hissed, a sound like steam escaping a valve. It was the evolution of the plague, a hunter perfectly designed for the wasteland. I fired. The 45mm round sparked off the creature's chest plate, chipping the calcified armor but not penetrating. It shrieked, a high-frequency noise that made my teeth ache, and lunged. It moved with terrifying speed, not the stiff shuffle of the dead, but the fluid, explosive energy of an ambushed predator. I scrambled back over a table, firing a controlled burst at its legs. The rounds shattered the knee joint, spraying a bluish, viscous fluid that smelled of ammonia. It collapsed, thrashing, its claws gouging deep furrows in the concrete floor. I didn't wait to see if it would get up. I turned and sprinted toward the laboratory sector, the adrenaline dumping into my system making the heavy pack feel weightless. I needed a secure room. I needed a heavy door. I slammed into the research lab airlock, spinning the wheel and locking it just as a heavy impact dented the steel from the outside. The scratching started immediately, frantic and hungry. I was safe, momentarily. I turned my light to the room I had trapped myself in. It was a treasure trove. And a horror show. Rows of glass canisters lined the walls, floor to ceiling. Inside them were organs. Hearts, lungs, brains, all pulsing with that same blue bioluminescence I had seen in the creature's blood. They were alive. Disembodied, separated but alive. The main terminal on the central desk was running on emergency power. I wiped the dust from the screen. Project Lazarus. Hive integration. The files detailed the true horror. The virus didn't just adapt individual hosts. It sought to create a collective. The bodies outside weren't just eating people. They were harvesting biomass to bring here. To build something. I looked at the large containment tank in the center of the room. It was shattered, the glass blown outward. A trail of slime, thick and shimmering, led from the broken tank into the massive ventilation shaft on the far wall. The shaft that led down into the geothermal sublevels. The logbook on the desk was open to the final entry, handwritten in shaky Cyrillic. We thought the cold would stop it. We were wrong. The cold just made it efficient. It has shed its humanity. It is building a queen. God forgive us, we are not the survivors. We are the fodder. I looked at my scavenging haul. The ammo, the socks, the gun. Useless trinkets. I wasn't in a research lab. I was in a hatchery. And the scratching at the door had stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant thrumming coming from the floor beneath my feet. The hive was waking up. I checked my magazine. 20 rounds. I grabbed a heavy canister of industrial ethanol from a shelf and a flare from my emergency kit. If I was going to die in this frozen hell, I was going to ensure the temperature in here got high enough to melt every single one of these frozen abominations. I primed the flare. The floor vents began to rattle. The airlock hissed, not a mechanical release, but the sound of pressure equalizing through a rusted seal that had held its breath for 20 years. My breath hung in the air, a persistent fog that obscured the beam of my tactical light. This was Object 44. The map I'd pulled off a dead Spetsnaz officer 3 weeks ago near Yakutsk called it a weather station. But weather stations don't have reinforced concrete perimeters and automated turret emplacements, even if those turrets were now drooping. Lifeless silhouettes against the gray Siberian sky. The cold here was a physical weight, pressing down on the layers of stolen fur and Kevlar I wore. It was 50 below zero outside. Inside, it felt colder, a tomb where the air had stopped moving in the late 90s. I stepped over the threshold, the Geiger counter clipped to my belt clicking lazily. Background radiation, nothing acute. That was the first surprise. I expected this place to be hot, a nuclear folly buried in the ice. Instead, it was silent. I moved deeper, the beam of my light cutting through the swirling dust motes. The hallway was lined with pipes encrusted in thick rime ice, looking like the ribcage of some massive, leviathan beast. My boots crunched on glass, shards of overhead lights, or maybe specimen jars. I stopped at a checkpoint booth. Inside, a desiccated corpse sat slumped over a console. No rot. The Arctic freeze had mummified him instantly, preserving the look of terror on his face. I rifled through his pockets with numbed fingers, the leather of my gloves stiff and unyielding. A pack of cigarettes, dry as bone. A keycard, snapped in half. A 9mm Makarov with one magazine. I checked the slide. Frozen shut. I had to warm it against the heat of my armpit for 10 minutes before I could rack it. That was the reality here. The environment was trying to kill me faster than the dead were. I found a break room further in. The vending machines were smashed, glass powdering the floor, but I pried open a locker with the edge of my pry bar. Canned stew. Frozen solid, heavy as bricks. I shoveled them into my pack. Scavenging in the apocalypse was usually about smell, avoiding the stench of rot. Here, it was about temperature. Heat was the currency. Then I saw the containment seals. Sector 4. Biohazard level, catastrophic. The doors had been welded shut from the outside, thick beads of steel tracing the frame, then torn open from the inside. Metal bent like wet cardboard. The edges of the breach were jagged, pointing outward. Something wanted out, and it had possessed strength that biology shouldn't allow. I stepped through the breach. The smell hit me first, not the sweet, sickly scent of decay I was used to in the cities. It smelled like ozone and copper. Sharp. Chemical. On the floor, the first of the subjects lay sprawled. It didn't look like the Shambles in Moscow. Its skin was translucent, blue veins mapping a road map of agony across a hairless skull. But the most terrifying part was the crystallization. The virus hadn't just reanimated the cells, it had weaponized the environment. Sharp, obsidian-like shards protruded from the shoulder blades and forearms, tearing through the lab coat. I knelt, examining the tissue. No blood pooled around it. The wounds were cauterized by ice. I found a terminal in the adjacent observation deck that still had juice, running on emergency backup geothermal power. The screen flickered green, casting long, dancing shadows. I accessed the logs, my heart hammering against my ribs. Project Borealis. The text scrolled. Asterisk subject 88 shows increased metabolic efficiency in sub-zero temperatures. The pathogen does not hibernate. It synthesizes an antifreeze glycoprotein. It thrives. It uses the host's nervous system as a superconductor. Asterisk I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. We thought the winter would save us. We thought the zombies would freeze solid and stop moving, that the horde would become statues until the spring thaw. We were wrong. The virus adapted. It turned the cold into fuel. These things weren't slow. They were superconductors. They were faster here. A sound tore me from the screen. The clicking of nails on metal grating. Fast. Staccato. Unlike the dragging shuffle of the dead. I killed the light. Darkness swallowed the corridor, absolute and suffocating. I listened. Asterisk click click click. Asterisk it was on the ceiling. I raised the shotgun, the metal barrel burning my cheek with its icy touch. The clicking stopped directly above me. I held my breath, the silence ringing in my ears. Then, a drop of liquid hit my face. It burned. I wiped it away. It wasn't saliva. It was supercooled fluid. I fired blindly upward. The muzzle flash illuminated a nightmare. A creature clinging to the pipes, limbs elongated, joints reversed like a grasshopper. It shrieked, a sound like grinding metal, and dropped. It didn't fall, it pounced. I rolled, feeling the wind of its claws. It landed where I had been standing, cracking the reinforced floor tiles. I pumped the shotgun. The creature twitched, its head snapping toward me with mechanical precision. Its eyes were milky white, but the pupils were blown wide, absorbing every photon of the fading muzzle flash. I fired again. Buckshot tore into its chest. No blood spray. Just a puff of icy dust and black ichor that looked like crude oil. It didn't stop. It lunged. I swung the butt of the gun, connecting with its jaw. Bones shattered with the sound of cracking ice, echoing through the empty lab. It scrambled back, hissing, scrabbling for purchase on the smooth floor. I saw the wound in its chest knitting together, not with flesh, but with new ice crystals forming a protective carapace. It was armoring itself. The kinetic energy of the shot was being converted into a crystalline defense. I turned and ran. I sprinted past the frozen guards, past the welded doors, my boots slipping on the frosted linoleum. Behind me, the shrieks multiplied. One voice became two, then a chorus. The hive was waking up. They sensed the heat of my body, a beacon in the void. I needed a secure room. I saw a heavy blast door labeled cryo storage. A gamble. If it was full of them, I was dead. If it was empty, I could seal it. I slammed my shoulder into the wheel, spinning it. Russ screamed. I could hear the wet slap of their feet on the metal, a stampede of frozen death. I squeezed through the gap and hauled the wheel back, the locking mechanism thumping home just as a heavy body slammed against the other side. The door shuddered. Dust fell from the ceiling. A claw scraped against the steel, a screech that set my teeth on edge. I was safe, for the moment. The room was bathed in the soft blue glow of preservation tanks. Rows of them. Hundreds. I walked down the aisle, wiping the frost from a viewport. Inside, a soldier in full tactical gear floated in suspension fluid. But his eyes were open, and they were black. The fluid wasn't clear. It was swirling with dark particulate matter. I checked the control panel at the end of the row. The power status was critical. Temperature regulation failing. Thaw sequence initiated. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. I looked at the thermometer on the wall. The temperature inside the room was rising. The geothermal vents were kicking in to compensate for the failing cryosystems. The room was warming up. I looked back at the tanks. In the tank nearest me, the soldier's finger twitched. Then a fist slammed against the glass from the inside. A hairline fracture appeared. Then another. The room echoed with the sound of stressing glass. I checked my ammo. 6 shells? And a room full of hundreds of sleeper agents waking up from a 20-year nap, evolved by the cold and hungry for heat. I spotted a ventilation grate high on the wall. It was small, tight, but it led away from the door and the tanks. I dragged a heavy crate over, climbing up. Behind me, the sound of shattering glass marked the beginning of the end. The first tank had breached. I shimmied into the vent just as a wet, gurgling roar filled the room below. I crawled into the dark, the metal freezing against my stomach, moving deeper into the bowels of the facility. Knowing that the only thing worse than the cold was what the cold had created. The wind outside was a physical weight. A screaming wall of white that had been battering the concrete carapace of the facility for the better part of a decade. My Geiger counter clicked rhythmically, a metronome counting down the seconds of my exposure. Though the radiation here was just background noise compared to the lethal chill. The blast door, stamped with the faded Cyrillic designation for Outpost Zima, looked less like an entrance, and more like the sealed maw of a tomb. It had taken me 3 hours to bypass the hydraulic locks, burning through my last canister of acetylene. But as the heavy steel groaned and shifted inward, the rush of stale, pressurized air that hit me wasn't just old, it was ancient. It smelled of ozone, recycled oxygen, and the copper tang of dried blood that had never been allowed to rot. I slipped through the gap, the beam of my tactical light cutting a cone through the dark, and sealed the world of ice behind me. The silence that followed was heavy, amplified by the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I wasn't just looking for shelter, I was looking for answers, and more importantly, calories. The interior was brutalist and efficient, gray concrete walls lined with conduit pipes that had long since frosted over. My breath plumed before me as I checked the entryway. A security checkpoint. 2 bodies lay slumped over the console, perfectly preserved by the sub-zero temperatures that had seeped into the facility after the power died. They weren't wearing hazmat suits. They were in standard fatigue, torn to shreds. I moved closer, keeping the barrel of my suppressed carbine raised. The wounds weren't from bullets. They were jagged, tearing lacerations, as if something had ripped through the Kevlar vests with the force of a hydraulic press. I knelt, ignoring the grimace on the frozen soldier's face, and began the routine I had perfected over 5 years of survival. Pockets first. A rusted lighter useless. A half-empty magazine of 45mm ammunition, gold. I slid the rounds into my dump pouch. His sidearm was a heavy Makarov variant, fused to its holster by ice. I wrenched it free, checking the slide. It was jammed, frozen solid. I left it. The real prize was the keycard dangling from his neck, encased in a layer of frost. I snapped the lanyard and tucked the card into my glove. Pushing deeper into the complex, I found the logistics wing. This was the lifeline. Rows of metal shelving, mostly ransacked, but the darkness had hidden things from the panic of the initial evacuation. I found a crate of MREs pushed behind a fallen ventilation duct. Russian military rations, heavy on fat and preservatives. I cut one open with my combat knife, the smell of chemically preserved beef stew hitting me like a glorious perfume. I ate a spoonful cold, the grease coating my mouth, feeling the energy hit my bloodstream almost instantly. I packed as much as I could carry, distributing the weight evenly. Batteries were next. I found a charging station with several heavy-duty lithium cells. My tester showed they held a 40% charge, enough to run my night vision for a week. This was a good haul. It should have felt like a victory. But the deeper I went, the more the architecture of the chaos disturbed me. The barricades weren't facing the entrance. They were facing the labs. The soldiers hadn't been fighting to keep people out. They were fighting to keep something in. I reached the central hub, a wide atrium dominated by a dead holographic table. The walls here were glass, looking into sealed observation chambers. This is where the scavenging turned to investigation. I needed to know what killed this place to ensure it didn't kill me. I forced the door to the primary server room using a crowbar, the metal screeching in the quiet. The emergency power was dead, but these military hard drives were shielded. I jacked my portable reader into the terminal, praying the battery would hold. The screen flickered to life, green text scrolling rapidly. Project Permafrost. The logs were fragmented, but the timestamps told a story of rapid escalation. Entry 404. The pathogen does not go dormant in the cold. It adapts. We assumed the necrotic tissue would freeze, rendering the host immobile. We were wrong. The virus acts as a biological antifreeze, replacing the water in the cells with a crystalline structure. It hardens them. I stopped reading, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature crawling up my spine. I looked through the glass into the lab below. There were containment tubes, shattered from the inside. Entry 412. Subject 9 exhibits dermal calcification. The skin is turning into a carapace. They are no longer responding to pain. Small arms fire is ineffective. They hunt by thermal signature. They are drawn to the heat of the living. I slowly lowered the terminal. I wasn't alone. I could feel it. The faint vibration in the floor grates. I switched off my flashlight, plunging the room into darkness, and flipped down my night vision goggles. The green phosphor grain revealed the atrium in ghostly detail. And there it was. Standing near the shattered remnants of a containment pod was a figure. It looked human, but elongated. The infection had warped the skeletal structure, stretching the limbs. Its skin was pale blue, almost translucent, covered in patches of jagged, white armor that looked like ice but grew from the bone. It didn't twitch or shuffle like the walkers in the cities. It stood perfectly still, a statue of frozen rage. I adjusted my grip on the carbine, my finger hovering over the trigger. The scavenger in me screamed to run, to take the food and leave, but the survivor knew that if these things could survive the Siberian winter, they could migrate. They were the evolution of the plague, a predator designed for the dead world we now inhabited. I took a step back, and my boot crunched on a shard of glass. The sound was deafening. The thing's head snapped toward me with mechanical precision. There were no eyes, just a smooth, armored ridge where the face should be. It screeched, a sound like grinding metal, and sprinted. It moved terrifyingly fast, a blur of blue and white. I fired. The suppressed shots puffed quietly, sparking off the creature's chest armor. It didn't even slow down. The rounds were ricocheting. I aimed lower, for the legs, the joints. One bullet found purchase in the knee, shattering the brittle connective tissue. The creature stumbled, crashing into a railing, but scrambled back up on 3 limbs, scuttling like a spider. I retreated into the hallway, slamming the heavy bulkhead door and spinning the locking wheel. The impact on the other side shook the dust from the ceiling. Thud. Thud. Screech. It was testing the metal. I backed away, chest heaving. The evolution wasn't just physical, it was tactical. They were armor-plated, cold-blooded hunters. I looked at the keycard in my hand, level 5 clearance. The armory was on the level below, according to the wall map. Heavier caliber. Incendiaries. The log said they hated heat. I checked my mag, 12 rounds left. I had to go deeper. I had to burn this place down. The scavenging was over. The extermination had to begin. If this permafrost variant got out of the tundra, there would be nowhere left to hide. I racked the slide of my weapon, checked the seal on my mask, and descended into the dark. Listening to the sound of the creature tearing through the steel door above me. The airlock cycled with a hydraulic groan that vibrated through the soles of my heavy Arctic boots. A mechanical heartbeat waking from a decade-long coma. Outside, the Siberian wind was a physical weight, a white wall of screaming ice that had hounded me for 3 days across the tundra. Inside, as the heavy steel seal hissed shut, the silence was instant and oppressive. It smelled of ozone, stale copper, and something sweeter, the lingering, sickly scent of formaldehyde masking deep rot. I clicked my headlamp on, the beam cutting through the suspended dust motes of the decontamination chamber. Object 19. That's what the encrypted map coordinates had called it. A ghost story in the intelligence community, a black site erased from the grim archives of the old world before the collapse. Now, it was just a potential grave with the promise of food. My Geiger counter remained silent, thank God, but I kept my thumb hovered over the safety of my suppressed carbine. The interior temperature was rising, the facility's geothermal generator likely still chugging away deep in the earth. Keeping this tomb warm for residents I prayed were dead. Moving past the decontamination showers, I found the first checkpoint. The plexiglass of the guard booth was starred with bullet impacts, but they had come from the inside. A skeleton in shredded tactical gear lay slumped over the console, a rusty Makarov pistol near its hand. I ignored the remains, focusing instead on the scavenging. My survival instinct had long ago overridden my squeamishness. I rifled through the desk drawers, the wood groaning in the quiet. Jackpot. A half-empty box of 9mm ammunition, a strip of potassium iodide tablets, and more importantly, a physical master key, a heavy magnetic card on a retractable lanyard. I swiped it on the reader. A red LED blinked, then turned green. The magnetic locks disengaged with a heavy clunk. I pushed through into the main corridor, my breath no longer fogging in the air. The facility was pristine in a disturbing way. Unlike the chaotic, blood-smeared ruins of the cities, this place felt sterile. The violence here had been contained, calculated. I needed supplies before I could worry about the mysteries of the lab. I followed the faded Cyrillic wall stencils toward the storage/logistics wing. The heavy doors here were pried open, likely by the staff in their final panic. Inside the supply depot, metal shelves towered into the darkness. I swept my light across them, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Most were empty, stripped bare, but the top shelves. They had been too high for a hurried looting. I dragged a crate over and climbed. Dust coated everything, but underneath it, I found miracles. Vacuum-sealed MREs, Russian military issue, high-calorie. Water purification tabs. A box of thermal flares. I stuffed my pack until the straps dug into my shoulders. It was enough to keep me alive for a month, maybe 2. I should have turned back then. I should have taken the loot and retreated to the airlock. But the curiosity, that fatal flaw of the survivor, pulled me deeper. I needed to know why this place existed, why the bullet holes were on the inside of the glass. I descended to sub-level 3 bioresearch. The atmosphere changed immediately. The air here was colder, recycled less frequently. The hum of the ventilation was a ragged wheeze. I entered a long observation gallery looking down into a containment pit. I wiped the grime from the viewing glass and froze. Below, in the dim emergency lighting, were the test subjects. They weren't like the shamblers I'd killed in the cities, rotten, slow, mindless bags of meat. These things were preserved. They stood perfectly still, arranged in rows like soldiers at attention. I directed my light through the glass, illuminating the one closest to the pane. Its skin was gray, pulled tight over muscle that looked hypertrophied. The veins were black and bulged against the surface, forming a web of dark lightning across its chest. But it was the bone structure that made my stomach turn. Spikes of calcified bone protruded from the knuckles and elbows. The virus hadn't just reanimated them, it had weaponized them. I moved to a workstation console on the observation deck, blowing dust off a leather-bound logbook. It was written in a frantic, jagged hand. I scanned the final entries, translating the Russian as best I could. Day 402, the Prometheus strain has adapted to the cold. We thought the sub-zero environment would slow the metabolic rate of the infected. We were wrong. It triggered a survival response. The virus is rewriting their cellular density to retain heat. They are evolving dermal armor, hardened keratin layers. I flipped the page. Day 415. They are not dormant. They are waiting. They have developed a pack mentality. We cut the power to the pit to conserve energy. They stopped moving to conserve calories. But they are watching. They are hungry. A sound. A wet clicking sound. Not from the pit, but from the corridor behind me. I spun around, raising my rifle. The beam of my light danced across the sterile white tiles. Nothing. Just the shadows of open doorways. I began to back away, the logbook tucked under my arm. The clicking came again, faster this time, sounding like knuckles cracking underwater. It was coming from the ceiling. I jerked my light up. The vent grate above me was gone. Crouched in the ductwork, staring down with eyes that reflected the light like polished obsidian, was one of them. It didn't groan. It hissed, a sound like steam escaping a valve. It dropped. The creature hit the floor with a heavy, wet thud, absorbing the impact with unnatural grace. It was naked, hairless, its skin a mottled bruised purple and gray. As it straightened up, I saw the evolution the logbook spoke of. Its fingers were elongated, tipped with jagged bone claws that dripped a black, viscous fluid. The chest cavity wasn't open and rotting. It was armored with a fused rib cage, a solid plate of bone. I squeezed the trigger. The suppressor coughed. 3 shots, center mass. The bullet sparked off the bone plate, tearing flesh but failing to penetrate the vitals. The creature didn't stumble. It shrieked, a high-frequency sound that made my teeth ache, and lunged. I dove to the right, crashing into a lab table, sending beakers shattering to the floor. The creature slammed into the metal cabinet where I had been standing, denting the steel with the force of a car crash. This wasn't a zombie. This was a predator. I scrambled back, my boots slipping on broken glass. I aimed for the head this time. The creature turned, its movements twitchy and fast, too fast for a corpse. I fired. The round took it in the shoulder, spinning it around. It roared, and from the darkness of the hallway, other shrieks answered. The pack. I didn't wait to see if they were as evolved as this one. I sprinted for the heavy bulkhead door at the end of the gallery. Behind me, I heard the wet slap of bare feet on tile, closing the distance. I slammed my hand onto the control panel. The door groaned, the motors protesting the sudden demand. Come on, come on! I screamed, leveling my rifle through the narrowing gap. The creature leaped, arms outstretched. I emptied the magazine. Rounds tore into its face, finally punching through the ocular cavity. It collapsed midair, sliding across the floor, its black blood hissing where it touched the tile. The door slammed shut, sealing with a heavy clank. I slumped against the metal, gasping for air, the adrenaline turning my blood to fire. On the other side of the door, the scratching started. Not mindless pawing, but testing. Searching for a weakness in the seal. I looked down at the logbook in my hand, then at the label on the wall next to me. Cryo-storage level 4 prototype containment. I wasn't safe. I had just locked myself deeper inside. The scratching grew louder, joined by others. The virus here hadn't just survived the end of the world. It had been preparing for what came next. And I was the first fresh meat to enter its den in years. The wind screaming across the Siberian Tundra was a physical weight, a relentless, invisible hand trying to push me face first into the permafrost. My respirator was caked in ice, every breath a labor of sucking air through frozen filters, but the shape ahead forced me to keep moving. Object 714. The rumors in the refugee camps back in Vladivostok hadn't done it justice. It wasn't just a bunker. It was a scar on the landscape, a brittlest concrete monolith partially swallowed by the snowdrifts. The steel blast doors slightly ajar like the lips of a corpse. I checked the action on my modified AK-12 for the third time in a minute. The grease was holding up against the sub-zero temperatures, but my fingers, even inside thermal gloves, felt like clumsy sausages. I squeezed through the gap in the blast doors, the metal groaning in the gale, and stepped into the silence. The transition was jarring. The howling wind was instantly cut off, replaced by the heavy, stale silence of a tomb. Emergency lighting flickered in a rhythmic, epileptic pulse, amber strobes that threw long, dancing shadows against the peeling containment paint. My boots crunched on something brittle. I looked down, illuminating the floor with my rail-mounted tactical light. It wasn't glass. It was a frozen pool of blood, crystallized into a jagged Rorschach test, littered with spent brass casings. 45 millimeters, standard military issue. A firefight happened here, but there were no bodies. Just the brass and the blood. I moved to the security kiosk, vaulting over the shattered glass partition. This was the first scavenging priority, intel and clearance. The guard's terminal was dead, smashed by a rifle, but the lockers behind the station were a scavenger's gold mine. I forced the first one open with my crowbar, the metal screeching in the quiet. Jackpot. 3 sealed boxes of military-grade antitoxins, a fresh gas mask filter, and a flare gun. I shoved them into my rucksack, the loot clinking reassuringly. But it was the second locker that gave me pause. Inside wasn't gear, but a scratch pad, frantic scribbles in Cyrillic. They don't freeze. They burn. Do not use thermal optics. I killed my thermal scope immediately, my heart hammering a new rhythm against my ribs. The standard infection, the shamblers we dealt with in the cities, slowed down in the cold. Their biological fluids would freeze, locking their joints. Winter was supposed to be our safety season, but this was a research lab. They weren't studying the wild strain here, they were cooking something else. I moved deeper, past the decontamination airlocks which stood wide open, hissing with residual pressure. The air grew warmer the further down I went, a humid, metallic heat that smelled of ozone and rotting meat. The facility was drawing power from a geothermal tap, keeping the lower levels viable, and keeping whatever was down here alive. Level 3, Biological Containment. The hallway here was a slaughterhouse. This time, there were bodies. Scientists in white lab coats, or what was left of them. They hadn't been eaten, they had been torn apart with mechanical precision. I knelt by a corpse, examining the wounds. The rib cage was splayed open, ribs snapped outward. Whatever did this didn't want the meat. It wanted to disable the host immediately. I saw the telltale black veins of the infection running up the victim's neck, but the texture was wrong. The veins weren't necrotic. They were hardened, calcified like subcutaneous armor. I took a sample, scraping the black substance into a vial. It clinked like stone. The virus here had adapted to the environment. It was reinforcing the host's skeletal structure, turning them into armored battering rams. I found the entrance to Lab 3B, the door torn off its hinges. Inside, rows of stasis tubes lined the walls. Most were smashed, but one remained intact, bathed in a soft blue light. I wiped the condensation from the glass and recoiled. The subject inside was evolved. It was a chaotic mesh of human physiology and something else. Its skin had turned translucent and pale, blending with the icy environment, but underneath, the muscle fiber was dense, corded like steel cables. Its fingers had elongated into bone hooks. But the most terrifying detail was the eyes. They were gone. In their place, fleshy, heat-sensing pits had developed across the upper face. The note in the lobby made sense now. They hunted by thermal signature. In the dark of the tundra, they didn't need to see you. They just needed to feel your warmth. I heard a sound then. A wet, clicking noise from the ventilation duct above me. Not the moan of the dead, but the chittering of a predator. I froze, my body temperature feeling like a beacon in the dark. I slowly reached for a flare, my movements fluid, silent. If they hunted heat, I had to give them a sun. The grate above me buckled. I didn't wait. I fired the flare gun down the corridor, the magnesium slug igniting with a blinding white intensity, sizzling at 3,000 degrees. The screech that followed was unearthly. From the shadows of the ceiling, 3 shapes detached themselves. They were fast, moving on all fours with spider-like agility. They ignored me, sprinting past my position, drawn irresistibly to the searing heat of the flare burning on the concrete. They piled onto the light, clawing at the fire, their heat pits overwhelmed, their instincts short-circuiting. I didn't stick around to watch them burn. I sprinted toward the server room at the end of the hall, my boots slamming against the floor. I needed the data, and I needed an exit strategy. The server room was a fortress, heavy blast doors sealed tight. I slapped an electronic bypass charge on the keypad, scavenged from a dead combat engineer miles back, and shielded my eyes. The small explosion popped the lock, and I shouldered my way inside, barricading the door behind me with a heavy filing cabinet. The room was humming with servers, the air frigid again. Safe for now. I began pulling hard drives, tossing them into my pack. This data was currency. It was the only thing that would buy me passage on to the last evacuation ship. But as I looted, I saw the main terminal screen. It was displaying a live feed from the lower containment levels. Thousands of thermal signatures were clustered around the geothermal core. They weren't just surviving, they were nesting. The heat from the core was incubating them, speeding up their metabolism. The graph on the screen showed a biomass exponential growth curve. They were breeding, or replicating, at a rate that was impossible for the standard strain. I looked closer at the feed. The creatures were piling bodies onto the reactor housing, creating a grotesque hive structure. And in the center, something massive was moving. Something that required the combined heat of a nuclear pile to sustain itself. I grabbed a prototype railgun sitting on a weapon rack, heavy, experimental. Useless without the battery pack I'd hopefully find in the armory, and checked my map. The only way out was through the maintenance tunnels, which ran parallel to the ventilation shafts. The same shafts those things were using to travel. I checked my magazines. 3 left. Plus the flare gun with 2 rounds. I looked at the temperature gauge on my wrist. I was running hot. Too hot. I unzipped my parka, letting the freezing air hit my sweat-soaked shirt, shivering violently to lower my body temperature. I had to become cold. I had to become invisible. I gripped the rifle, took a breath of the stale, recycled air, and prepared to step back out into the dark. The scavenging was done. Now, the hunt began. The wind outside was a physical weight, a screaming wall of white noise that had battered my rover for 3 days straight, burying the treads in drifts of razor-sharp ice. But the silence inside the facility was heavier. I stood before the blast doors of Sector 0, the frost on my respirators turning to rime every time I exhaled. The hydraulic seal had been cracked years ago, likely by the desperate clawing of those trying to get in, or out. I squeezed through the gap, my hazmat suit scraping against the frozen steel with a sound that vibrated in my molars. The interior was a tomb, preserved in the absolute zero of a power failure that had lasted a decade. My Geiger counter clicked rhythmically, a slow, syncopated heartbeat in the dark, confirming low-level radiation, but nothing acute. It was the cold that would kill me first. I clicked on my tactical light. The beam cut through the stagnant air, illuminating a reception area that looked like a slaughterhouse frozen in time. Bodies were everywhere. Military police, scientists in white coats, maintenance staff. They weren't decomposed. The extreme Siberian cold had mummified them, turning their skin into taut, gray parchment stretched over bone. There was no smell of rot, only the metallic tang of ozone and old blood that had sublimated into dust. I moved to the nearest guard, a man slumped over a security desk, his uniform stiff as board. His eyes were open, clouded over with intricate fern patterns of ice crystals, staring eternally at the ceiling. I wasn't here to mourn. I was here to scavenge. I patted him down with practiced efficiency, my thick gloves making the search clumsy. No sidearm, but his belt held 2 spare magazines for a standard issue 9mm and a heavy-duty keycard attached to a retractable lanyard. I took them. Behind the desk, I pried open a rusted lockbox with my pry bar. Inside, a stash of emergency flares, a box of 56mm ammunition, miraculously dry, and 3 medical injectors labeled adrenaline/stimulant. Gold dust. I shoved them into my pack, the crinkle of the packaging echoing too loudly in the vaulted room. The facility layout was etched into the wall, a faded schematic under cracked plexiglass. Sector 4, cryogenics, was on the lowest sublevel. That's where the answers, and the high-grade viral suppressants, would be. I bypassed the elevators. They were metal coffins waiting to trap the careless. I took the stairs. The stairwell was a spiral into the abyss, the concrete walls smeared with a dark, resinous substance that absorbed the beam of my light. It looked like dry tar, but as I descended to sublevel 2, the texture changed. It was fractal, crystalline. The infection here hadn't just killed the hosts, it had tried to terraform the environment. The biomass of the dead had been repurposed to grow this lattice, a web of black veins that pulsed with a faint, bioluminescent blue when I swept my light over them. On sublevel 2, I raided a break room. The vending machines were smashed, glass covering the floor like diamond dust. I ignored them and went for the pantry in the back. Vacuum-sealed crackers, powdered coffee, and a crate of Arctic issue MREs. I loaded everything that wasn't compromised. Survival isn't about glory, it's about calories. I sat on a crate for a moment, cracking a thermal pack to warm my freezing fingers. While the heat seeped into my gloves, I picked up a data pad lying on the floor. It was dead, but I plugged it into my portable battery bank. The screen flickered to life, showing the last entry, dated 5 years ago. DR, Arisov. Day 402. The cold doesn't stop it. We were wrong. We thought the Siberian winter would be a natural containment wall. But the pathogen, strain Delta 9, it adapts. It's using the frost. It's rewriting the cellular structure of the host to utilize ice crystals as a structural lattice. They don't freeze solid, they become armored. We hear them in the vents. They sound like breaking glass. God help us, they don't rot. They crystallize. I unplugged the pad and stood up, the silence suddenly feeling predatory. Armored. The standard shamblers back in the cities were flesh and rot. A headshot turned them off like a switch. If the things down here were reinforced with ice. I checked the chamber of my rifle. Tungsten core rounds. I had maybe 30 left. It would have to be enough. Sub-level 3 was the barracks. I moved room to room, looting lockers with trembling hands. The temperature was dropping the deeper I went. I found a pristine thermal undersuit, still in its plastic wrap, and swapped it for my filthy, sweat-stained layers right there in the dark. The relief was instantaneous. I also found a suppressed MP5 with subsonic rounds, useless against armor, but good for stealth if I encountered anything softer. I strapped it to my chest rig. Then, sub-level 4. The air here was different. It tasted sharp, chemical. The blood on the walls was thicker here, forming stalactites that hung from the ceiling like teeth. I stepped carefully, avoiding the black puddles that hadn't frozen despite the temperature. The lab was a maze of shattered glass and overturned centrifuges. In the center of the main virology bay, a row of containment tubes stood floor to ceiling. Most were broken, the liquid inside long evaporated. One was intact. Inside floated a subject. It was human once. Now, it looked like a sculpture of obsidian and diamond. Spikes of black bone protruded from its shoulders and elbows, piercing the skin. Its flesh was a mosaic of bluish-gray scales, glistening in the light of my torch. The eyes were gone, replaced by smooth, faceless bone. This was the evolution. The virus, starved of biomass, had turned inward, calcifying the host into a perfect survival machine for the tundra. It wasn't dead. It was waiting. I moved to the terminal connected to the tube. I needed the data. If there was a cure, or even a weapon, the blueprints were here. I slotted the keycard I'd found earlier. The system groaned, spinning up hard drives that hadn't moved in years. Green text scrolled across the CRT monitor, casting a sickly glow over the room. Download initiated, Project Frostbite. That's when I heard it. A sharp, brittle crack. Like a tree branch snapping in a winter storm. I froze. My light swept the room. The shadows danced, but nothing moved. Then another crack. Louder. It was coming from the walls. I looked at the black resin. A hairline fracture appeared in the crystalline growth near the ceiling vents. It wasn't just residue. It was a hive. The heat from the terminal, the battery, my own body heat radiating into the room. It was waking them up. The stalactite above me shifted, detaching with a wet tear. It wasn't a formation, it was a limb. A creature dropped to the floor, landing on all fours with the sound of ceramic hitting concrete. It was smaller than the tank in the tube, thin and jagged, its body covered in the same frost armor. It had no eyes, just a row of heat-sensing pits along its snout. It hissed, a sound like steam escaping a valve, and turned its head toward me. I didn't hesitate. I raised the rifle and fired. The tungsten round sparked off its shoulder, shattering the outer layer of ice but failing to penetrate the bone beneath. The creature shrieked, a high-frequency noise that made my vision blur and my teeth ache. It lunged. I dove to the right, crashing into a lab table. Beakers shattered, sending shards of glass skittering across the floor. The creature slammed into the metal where I had been standing, its claws gouging deep furrows in the stainless steel. I scrambled back, switching to full auto, aiming for the joints where the armor looked thinner, near the neck and underarms. The muzzle flash lit up the room in strobe light horror. I saw others peeling themselves off the walls, shedding their hibernation chrysalises like insects. They were everywhere. I grabbed the portable drive from the terminal. Download be damned, I had enough, and sprinted for the door. The first creature recovered and leaped, closing the distance with terrifying speed. I swung the rifle butt, connecting with its skull. It felt like hitting a brick wall. The impact jarred my arm to the shoulder, sending a shockwave of pain down my spine. But it knocked the thing back long enough for me to clear the threshold. I hit the manual override for the bulkhead. The heavy steel door began to slide shut, agonizingly slow. The creatures were swarming now, a tide of black ice and teeth. They threw themselves at the closing gap. Claws scrabbled against the metal, screeching like banshees. One managed to jam its arm through the opening. I saw the limb up close, translucent flesh, black veins, and fingers ending in hooks of frozen bone. I drew my combat knife and hacked at it, chipping away the ice until the blade bit into meat. It shrieked and retracted. The door slammed shut, the locking wheel spinning into place with a definitive clank. I didn't wait. I ran. Up the stairs, lungs burning, the cold air tearing at my throat like swallowed glass. I could hear them banging against the door below, a rhythmic, heavy thudding that shook the stairwell. They were breaking through. The evolution hadn't just made them tough, it made them strong. They were designed to survive pressure, cold, and time. A steel door was just an inconvenience. I reached the lobby, vaulting over the reception desk. The frozen guard I had looted earlier was twitching. The vibration, the noise, it was waking everything. The dead bodies were cracking their icy joints, heads turning with the sound of grinding stones. Their mouths opened, jaws unhinging to reveal blackened gums and crystalline teeth. I didn't stop to fight. I shoulder-checked the airlock, tumbling out into the blinding white of the storm. I scrambled into the rover, slamming the hatch and hitting the ignition. The engine sputtered, protesting the cold, before roaring to life. As I floored the accelerator, the facility doors burst open. Not by the creatures, but by the sheer pressure of the swarm behind them. They poured out into the snow, screeching at the sudden drop in temperature. But they didn't stop. They began to run, cutting through the snowdrifts like sharks through water, their armored bodies impervious to the gale. I drove into the whiteout, watching the rear monitor until the static swallowed them up. I had the drive. I had the supplies. But I also had the knowledge that the winter was no longer our ally. The cold wasn't killing them. It was forging them. The wind outside was a physical weight, a screaming wall of white noise that had battered me for 3 days across the tundra. But inside the airlock of Facility 33B, the silence was heavier. It was a pressurized, suffocating silence that pressed against my eardrums. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, a thumping drum against the cowl of my parka. I cycled the heavy wheel of the inner blast door. It groaned, a screech of rusted metal against metal that echoed down into the bowels of the earth like a dinner bell for the damned. I froze, rifle raised, breath misting in the red glow of my dying chem light. Nothing answered. No moans, no shuffling. Just the settling of 6,000 tons of reinforced concrete, and the hum of the ventilation trying to ghost start on backup power. I moved in. The temperature didn't rise. If anything, the air inside felt sharper, colder, stripped of humidity, and smelling of ozone and ancient, settled dust. The lobby was a tomb of brutalist Soviet architecture, gray slate and peeling propaganda posters boasting of scientific supremacy. The reception desk was barricaded, not with furniture, but with bodies. They were frozen solid, preserved in the eternal sub-zero climate of the unheated facility. I approached them with the caution of a man who had seen the dead wake up too many times. These were different, though. No bite marks. No torn throats. Their faces were twisted in agony, veins black and bulging against pale skin, but they had died screaming, clutching their chests. The infection here hadn't been a slow rot. It had been a catastrophic systemic failure. Scavenging mode kicked in. It was a reflex born of 2 years in the wasteland. I vaulted the desk, my boots crunching on shattered glass and frozen shell casings. I needed filters for my mask, antibiotics, and calories. I found a stash of stale biscuits and a half-empty bottle of vodka in a drawer, along with a keycard labeled Sector 4 cryogenics. I pocketed them. The bodies wore military fatigues, high-grade winter gear that was worth killing for. I stripped a corpse of its tactical vest, transferring 3 magazines of 5.45 ammo to my rig. The dead soldier's fingers were brittle, snapping like dry twigs as I pried the rifle from his grip. It was an AK-12, pristine condition, still smelling of gun oil. An upgrade. I swapped it for my battered hunting rifle, checking the action. It cycled smooth as silk. I pushed deeper. The corridors were a maze of sterile white tiles and flickering emergency strobes that must have triggered when I breached the seal. The shadows stretched and danced, playing tricks on my peripheral vision. I kept my back to the wall, checking corners, the Geiger counter on my wrist clicking rhythmically. Low background radiation, safe enough for now. The evolution of the virus was something we whispered about in the survivor camps back south, theories about mutations and strains, but here, in the heart of the tundra, I was seeing the source code. The walls of the hallway leading to the research wing were covered in a strange growth. Not the fleshy, rotting biomass of the city hives. This was crystalline. Black fractals spreading across the concrete like frost, glittering under my flashlight beam. I touched it with the barrel of my rifle. It was hard as diamond. The virus here hadn't just consumed the organic matter, it had mineralized it. Room 402. Observation. The glass was reinforced, looking down into a containment pit. I wiped the condensation away with a gloved hand. Below, huddled in the corner, was a mass of shapes. Test subjects. They weren't moving. I needed to get down there. The manifest on the wall indicated the medical storage was on the lower level, past the pit. I forced the door, the hydraulic hiss sounding like a snake strike. The smell hit me then, not rot, but chemicals. Formaldehyde, copper, and something sharp like sulfur. I swept the room. Rows of stainless steel tables. Notes scattered everywhere, frozen to the floor. I picked up a clipboard. The Cyrillic was frantic, the handwriting deteriorating into jagged scratches. Subject 14 shows adaptation to xerothermal environments. Metabolism has stopped. Cellular structure hardening. The virus is synthesizing a natural antifreeze. I lowered the paper, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. They weren't dead. They were hibernating. The cold didn't kill them, it preserved them. I moved silently toward the medical lockers. My heart hammered against my ribs, a traitorous rhythm in the quiet. I grabbed handfuls of syringes, epinephrine, morphine, broad-spectrum antibiotics, and stuffed them into my pack. I found a ruggedized laptop and shoved it in. The data could be worth more than gold to the resistance. Then a sound. A sharp crack, like ice breaking on a frozen lake. I spun around. The massive shapes in the pit. One had shifted. It stood up, disjointed, its movements jerky and mechanical. It didn't look like the Shamblas I knew. Its skin was translucent blue, the veins underneath thick black ropes pulsing with a slow, sludge-like viscosity. Patches of that crystalline frost armored its shoulders and chest, growing out of the skin like chitin. It turned its head, and I saw eyes that were solid white orbs, devoid of pupils. It sniffed the air. It could smell the heat coming off me. My body heat was a beacon in their world of ice. I raised the AK-12. Stay down, I whispered, the sound barely escaping my lips. It shrieked. A sound so high-pitched it made my teeth ache and shattered a beaker on the nearby table. It wasn't a vocal cord scream. It was the sound of air being forced through a constricted, frozen throat. The other shapes on the floor began to twitch. The ice on their joints cracked as they rose. They didn't stumble. The first one launched itself at me with terrifying speed, clearing a steel table in a single bound. I fired. The muzzle flash illuminated the room in strobe light terror. The bullets hit the creature, but instead of tearing through rotting flesh, they sparked. The crystalline armor deflected the first 2 rounds. The third punched through its neck, spraying black ichor that hissed where it touched the floor. It didn't stop. It slammed into me, knocking the wind out of my lungs. The cold radiating off it was intense, burning my skin through my layers. Its fingers were tipped with bone claws, sharpened and elongated, fused with a black crystal. It slashed at my face, tearing my gas mask, sending a spiderweb of cracks across the lens. I kicked it away, scrambling backward, my boots slipping on the slick floor. I switched to full auto. The roar of the rifle was deafening in the confined space. I walked the fire up its chest to its head. The skull shattered like a ceramic pot, chunks of frozen brain matter exploding outward. It dropped, twitching. But the others were coming. 10, maybe 20 of them. They were fast, agile, adapting to the terrain. One was climbing the walls, its claws digging into the concrete like ice picks. This was the evolution. The virus hadn't just reanimated them, it had weaponized them against the environment. They were the apex predators of the wasteland. I turned and ran. I sprinted back through the maze, abandoning stealth. Behind me, the chorus of shrieks multiplied, echoing through the vents. I fumbled for a grenade on my belt, a flash bang. I pulled the pin and dropped it behind me without looking. The explosion washed out my vision for a second, but the scream of the creatures turned into confusion. Their thermal senses overloaded by the sudden heat and light. I hit the stairwell, taking the steps 3 at a time. My lungs burned in the cold air, tasting blood. I needed to seal the lab. If these things got out, if they migrated south, the winter wouldn't save us anymore. The winter would belong to them. I reached the security station at the entrance. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the keycard twice. The screeching was getting closer. I could hear the click-click-click of their claws on the tile, a chaotic rhythm of death. I swiped the card. Initiate lockdown, I yelled at the dead terminal, slamming my fist on the emergency override button. Klaxons flared to life, rotating orange lights bathing the lobby in a hellish glow. Blast doors began to descend slowly from the ceiling. I dove under the closing gate of the main entrance, my backpack snagging on the metal. I yanked it free, ripping a strap, spilling a box of gauze. I didn't stop to pick it up. I rolled into the airlock just as the inner door slammed shut with a final, earth-shaking thud. I could hear them on the other side. They were pounding on the steel, a rhythmic, synchronized hammering that dented the heavy metal. I fell back against the outer door, gasping, wiping the black sludge from my broken mask off my cheek. I was alive. I had the meds. I had the data. But as I looked at the heavy steel door, watching it vibrate with the force of the blows from inside, I realized the terrifying truth. The virus had learned. It had conquered the cold. And now, it knew we were here. I pushed open the outer hatch, stumbling back into the blinding white of the blizzard. The storm felt welcoming now. Compared to what was waking up inside Facility 33B, the freezing wind was a mercy. I adjusted my pack, checked my magazine, and started the long trek back to the snowmobile, looking over my shoulder with every step. Knowing that the spring thaw would bring something worse than floods.